what you could say slash the mind, right? So something like 95% of the data which comes in through our senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, etc., is actually screened out by the spinal column and by the nervous system before those impulses and before those signals and before that data reaches the brain, right? So we're actually taking in data through our senses continuously. We're taking in way too much data through our senses, in fact, for our brain to process and for our mind to process. So, when we're talking about perception in Buddhism, we're actually talking about cognition, right? The formulation of the thoughts, the assembly, the assimilation and construction of the data into something, right? So, if you smell some food, you taste some food, right? And, you touch it, etc., you're taking in sensory information, right? And then that's cognized into broccoli or chocolate or whatever it might be, right? Like there is no taste for broccoli, that scientifically the tongue detects 4 or 5 different tastes, whatever it is, sweet, salty, sour, I don't know what it is, That's all that sense organ of the tongue is capable of detecting is 4 different things, right? Then the olfactory senses are capable of detecting, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of different kinds of molecules, right? Which, then is combined, those different olfactory molecules and sense data coming in through the tongue and the other senses are all combined by the mind to say, that's a piece of broccoli, right? That's chocolate. I like that, and I don't like that, and right? So when we're talking about perception, and we're talking about valid perception, would it even make sense to say, that's not a valid perception of broccoli? Because broccoli is a mental construct, right? So when we're talking about perception, and when we're talking about valid perceptions, and we're really talking about the constructs and how the mind is assembling the data and how the mind is assembling the information, right? There is no broccoli. There is no such thing as the taste of broccoli that everyone tastes the same, right? Everyone's taste of broccoli is different. It has different, sensitivity of the olfactory sense and all the rest, right? So tell me if I digress too much because we're gonna cover the material. So double digression. Good.
We're just going to take a free flow and then freestyle it. So then as the mind, on that note, if the capacity of one's mind begins to
change
or expand,
mm-hmm.
then that would also mean that the amount of what we can sense would also therefore expand.
Yeah, what does it mean to, look, if we just stick to the realm of what we scientifically document and observe, I don't remember the scientific terms, but, there are individuals whose rods and cones detect millions more colors than the normal person, right? And there's a name for that, right? As one example. So, that's an example of someone with a sensory capacity, which is 1,000-fold more refined or magnitudes beyond what the ordinary person's visual capacity is, right? There are people, I was reading an article last week, there are people who they hear colors, right? Whatever it is. So there are all kinds of things like that. And then if you're going to do the Buddhist thing and say, well, there are different realms and different dimensions, it's the same idea, right? It's just a continuation of the same idea, which is as one's perceptual faculties change or evolve or become more sophisticated or refined or whatever you want to call it, then the capacity to perceive information increases. And then what does the mind do with that information? And how does the mind construct that information and conceptualize that information and project that onto the stuff that's being perceived, right? So when we're talking about perception, it's important to be aware that we're not talking about the organs. We're talking about the mind, right? And what the mind is doing. And and we're going to dig into it more deeply, but if you think about it, we go through our lives in an unexamined sense, which is not a judgment. It's just that, we don't walk around going, my eyes are taking in wavelengths of light, which are really photons, which are really neither a wave nor a particle. and then it's really striking a cell, and that's really a sodium ion, which is moving across the cell wall, causing electrical charge, which is then transmitting down, these other cells, which is then causing this thing to happen over here, which is then me saying, that's yellow, right? I mean, it's not how we live our lives, right? It's not how we're walking around. We don't do that, right? I mean, we don't walk around going like, well, there are little square things in my what is the thing in your little curly tubes in your ear canal and your cochlea. These little squares or triangles in my cochlea floating in fluid, and when I tip my head like this, they shift like that, and they touch these hairs, and those hairs cause this little thing to happen over here, and then I feel like I'm falling, and I say, oh, I'm falling, move over here. This is not how we exist, right? This is not how we function. But if we take the time to really look at it, and if we take the time to really think about it and examine it, I mean, scientifically, right, or mechanically, that's what's going on, right? We're saying, oh, there's like all this stuff happening continuously. I mean, you almost can't describe the levels of the sophistication, of the complexity of all the stuff that's going on in the background, right? And we're going like, oh yeah, that's red. Oh, I'm leaning a little too far to the right. I'm going to fall. And we're sort of consciously functioning at the level of I like this and I like that and that's pink and that's blue and they're good and they're bad and I'm happy and I'm unhappy and I better not step in the puddle because my foot's going to get wet. And there's like vast amount of information and stuff behind all that sort of surface layer, if you will, of sort of stream of thought, sort of conscious mental process or whatever you want to call it, right? So, from a Buddhist perspective, we tend to be looking at it from more of the examined side, the more examined perspective. And 1,000, 2,000 years ago, they didn't have electron microscopes and all the rest, and they weren't talking about neurological functioning and those kinds of things. They were talking about like the ideas, right? So we can talk about the ideas and we can supplement them with what we discovered through scientific experimentation and in our own life and our own experience, right? So, but generally speaking, I mean, this is class 4, so you've talked about conventional reality and ultimate reality if you're here for the earlier classes, right? So, generally speaking, we live conventional lives in conventional reality, right? Conventional reality is a reality or a world or a way of existing where we have the simple unexamined me and we, see what our mind constructs and projects. We experience what our mind constructs and projects, right? We're taking in information through our senses, all of our senses. The mind's taking that information, assembling it, constructing, projecting, and conceptualizing and saying, blue, red, good, bad, boy, girl, and all the rest, right? And so we live at that level. We exist at that level, right? And that's not the only level of reality that exists. That's not the only way to function. That's not the only way to perceive. Which is, I mean, it's pretty self-evident, right? I mean, you could look at bugs or dogs or, or whatever you want to see that people and beings perceive in all different kinds of levels of conceptualization and projection and perception, right? Some beings don't have color, some beings are blind, some beings are these faculties and not other faculties. I mean, we can confirm directly, in our overt material world that there's a whole range and spectrum of perceptual abilities and capacities, right? Both at a sense level and a conceptual level. So from a Buddhist perspective, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get to a point where we are not living a simple unexamined life, right? We're trying to get to a point where we understand reality at a deeper level, where we understand, and perception is integral to that. Perception, understanding perception, the nature of perception, how perception works, is essential and integral to that. To say, if this isn't the only reality, what other realities are relevant to me, and how do I experience them or understand them or perceive them or, know about them in some way, right? And so that's really what Proof of Future Lives is about, So what Proof of Future Lives is about is saying, well, what is there besides what I can see and what I can experience, right? And so as you go through this course, you'll get into that material, and so that's a little digression. Back to the class material. So there are 5 things which are not, yeah, sure. Mhm. Yeah, that's good. Okay, great. Does that work okay?
Yeah.
Okay, better. So when we talk about seeing things, so the first way in which we perceive things inaccurately in a way where they're not accurate perceptions is look shade, which is things are completely backwards. You know, perhaps you have, you know, cataracts and you see fuzzy stuff all over everything you look at, or perhaps you have, you know, jaundice and everything looks slightly yellow to you, or go ahead. Yeah.
So if it's totally wrong for who? Like, because if that's
Mhm.
their perception, then
Mhm.
who's saying it's wrong?
So let's,
They figure it
yeah,
out later
yeah.
and they're like, oh, no, it's wrong.
So could you say that anything you perceive, no matter what it is right for you? Is that
As long
kind of
as
the
your mind's
question?
not affected. But who knows if your mind's affected? If your mind's affected, you don't know it, and that is accurate for you in that moment. No? I don't know. That seems like what we learned. But okay.
Well, let's talk. Let's go through it
Okay.
and see to what degree we address it, and then come back to it. Come back to the question if it still remains, right? Because yeah, it's perplexing, right? If somebody says, "Look, I'm perceiving something. Why are you telling me it's not a valid perception?" Right? So again, this is from the Buddhist commentarial tradition where they're saying,
How
it,
is mind wrong in school? Is that why?
well, in part, I mean, but this is part of the Buddhist commentarial tradition where they say, look, if you want to know what's a correct perception, this is what we define as a correct perception to be. This is what we define not a valid perception to be, and this is how we define it. So, you know, and all of this comes from the idea of, you know, is there other reality? Is there a higher reality? Is there, you know, are there higher realms? Are there lower realms, right? You know, are there other realities? Can you perceive them? How can you perceive them, right? How do you know you're not crazy when you're perceiving them? Right? So that's the point of all this, right? The point of all this is to try to provide a frame of reference to say, like, look, Buddha says there's, you know, nirvana, it says there's enlightenment, it says there's like, you know, countless other realms, right? How do you know? Haven't seen it, can't see it, right? Prove it, right? And so, you know, and if somebody does it this way, is that valid or not? If somebody does it that, is that valid or not? If you happen to be seeing this, is that valid or not? If you're having that trip, is that valid or not? Right? So we're going to talk about what valid is. I mean, it's definition in terms, right? So that's why we're defining terms. So, okay. So, so a mistaken perception, like, you know, you're drugged up and, you know, you think there's like a flying purple, you know, pony in the room, but there really isn't, or something like that, right? So, you know, the mind is completely kind of torqued, if you could say, I guess, or, you know, or the organs could be not functioning properly, you know, for example, medically, right? So, so that's the first one. The mistaken perception, which is just backwards, right? So the second one is called tetsom, which is doubt. And so what does doubt mean? Like to have doubt in your mind. Does he like me? Doesn't she like me? I don't know. You know? You know? If you can say something.
No, I was just thinking that's interesting. So then doubt is to the degree what's considered to be like you could be so wrong, like so toxic with doubt that it could actually
Yeah.
be
Well,
considered not and it's an affliction.
so you go out on your first date, right? And you come home and you're like, did they like me or they didn't like me? And you don't know. So how do you get a valid perception out of that? How do you get an accurate, valid perception out of, you know, I can't decide. I'm not sure, right? It's difficult, right? So the mind is split. The mind is split about its object, right? And so therefore, almost by definition, you can't have a valid perception. You can't have a clear, valid perception, right? Because when you talk about what a valid perception is, what a pramana is, what did we say in the beginning of class, right? It's a fresh, unerring, unmistaken state of mind, right? So if you have doubt, is your mind erring? Well, it's saying it's both or it's neither, and I can't decide. So it's not really an unmistaken state of mind, right? It's not unerring because it's vacillating back and forth between they like me, they don't like me, or whatever you might have doubt about, right? So, I mean, it could be, I'm not sure when class is. I thought class was Wednesday, but it's Tuesday. There's sort of countless ways that you can have doubt, right? So not to be sure about something means you're not grasping the object clearly or directly. So you're not having a clear, direct, unmistaken perception in that context, right? So it doesn't matter if you accurately perceived it if you're unsure, right, about what it is. So it's like I went to the movies last night. It was a little dark, and I thought I saw my friend Bill in the third row. I know I saw somebody in the third row. I know there's a guy there, but I'm not sure if it was Bill or not. I definitely perceived a guy there, but I can't make up my mind whether it's Bill or not, right? So it's not an unmistaken mind, right? So I mean, in Buddhism, if you're a good Buddhist, you're not supposed to say anything unless you're certain about it. You're not supposed to make a statement about anything unless you're certain about it, frankly. So if one were really a good Buddhist, one would not offer sort of random opinions which are unqualified, right? And so in some respects, the less one talks as a Buddhist, the better, I think. Sometimes. So a Buddhist is not supposed to say anything unless they have a sema or a valid perception about the object or about something, right? So, like you say, for example, you see you're driving by and there's a farm, for example, and you see somebody out in the field and you're like, oh, there's a guy out in the field there, out in the crops, right? But it's not a guy, it's a scarecrow. So that's the example of the first case. You're just totally off. That's you're way off the mark. You say there's a guy standing out in the field. It's not a guy, it's a scarecrow, and you just got it totally wrong, right? So or if you had said, oh, there's somebody out there, and I can't tell if it's a scarecrow or if it's a guy, that would be the second one, right? So, so there are these five states of mind which are not valid perception. They're basically how we live our lives, I guess, is an easy way to summarize it. We kind of go through our lives experiencing non-semas, non-pramanas most of the time. So the third one is called chishe. It means recollection. And if I saw the cupcake out front on the way in, right, and it was a valid perception of the cupcake on the counter on the way in, and now I'm thinking about the cupcake, right? But it's not a valid perception. It's not a tsema. It's not a pramana. Why? Any guess? It's not fresh. It's not fresh.
It's not based on the sense faculty.
Well, so if you think about perception, right? It's an old perception, right? So the moment one has a perception, I'm perceiving you, and it's a fresh perception. Everything is vibrant, clear, accurate according to the capacity of my senses, right? So you walk out of the room, and I remember that, but it's not as clear, right? It's not as vibrant, it's not as accurate, it's not as precise, right? So it's no longer a fresh state of mind. So recollections are not considered semas or pramanas, right? Okay. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with them. And so it's important to sort of be clear that we're not saying there's anything wrong with these things. They're just not pramanas, not semas, not the definition of, reality, if you will, right?
Do you have a valid perception of your memory?
Sure. Well, this is mind-only school. So, in other schools, they would say yes. But if you start mixing up schools, it gets very confusing. So obviously we're sitting here thinking our thoughts. I mean, I'm listening to my thoughts, sometimes, I'm seeing the tree and the fan and all the rest. From the perspective of the moment my sight goes from the plant to the fan, the perception of the plant a moment ago is no longer, a pramana because it's old. And it's very interesting. If you look at, I mean, science is kind of interesting in this regard because if you look at studies they've done on memory and how memory works, right? from a neurological perspective. It's very interesting. They say memory is actually chunked in the brain. You know, we don't actually remember the thing we think we remember. You know, we think we remember, I went there and I did this and I had this conversation. And what scientists have actually documented is that the brain is actually storing primary chunks of information and leaving lots out, leaving lots of detail out, and lots of stuff out. And so when we have a memory, what scientists have documented is we're actually accessing certain bits, certain incomplete bits that are stored there. And we are creatively filling in around those bits to make a narrative and to make a memory, right? So very interesting that what science is documenting now is there's no such thing as an accurate memory. You know, you just got chunks and you fill in like whenever you call up the chunks. And what you fill in could be, you know, any variations of a number of things. Yeah.
When you're filling things in, but where's that coming from? Right here, where you are in that moment.
Well, from a Buddhist perspective, we would say karma. From a scientific perspective, I don't know what they say because I didn't study it in depth. I just read an article. I don't know what the scientific basis is of how the neurons work and how they do that. So from a Buddhist perspective, what we say is that, you know, what ripens, what arises within us is the ripening of our karma, right? I mean, and so that's of course 5. We didn't get there yet, but anyway, we'll digress a little bit. So from a Buddhist perspective, you know, we have countless karmic seeds. You know, every time we say something or think something or do something, you know, we're collecting karmic seeds. A seed is a metaphor. It's sort of an easy handle to talk about things. So we're collecting these karmic seeds. And so we have these vast quantities of karmic seeds we've collected, right? And, you know, and another way to talk about it is to say they're like energetic impulses that you know, that arise. When a karmic seed ripens, it's equivalent to an energetic impulse arising. You could say a subtle energetic impulse arising. And, you know, if one meditates well and one is attentive to one's inner life, right, one can observe sort of these subtle impulses arising, which then become more gross, coarse impulses, which then translate to a thought. And the way it usually works is something arises, right? Mind gets involved and says, what is that? You know, and then it sort of scrolls through its list of options. Am I happy? Am I sad? Am I angry? Am I upset? Am I really, you know, what am I? You know, and it's all in a millisecond, right? And then it says, oh, that's good. I like that. I'm happy. That feels really nice. You know, so it all started with this subtle stuff arising, right? And then which then the mind engages, and the mind starts to think thoughts and narratives and ideas and the rest. So when these subtle impulses arise, like when these karmic seeds arise, right? When they're triggered, when they flower, why does the mind engage the way it does? Why does the mind say, I don't like that sensation. I want this sensation, not that sensation. Or I don't like that happened. I like that I wanted the other thing to happen. Or I really like that happened. This is really good. So, you know, so why is it that we think the thoughts we think? Like, where are my thoughts coming from? Why are these thoughts popping into my head right now? Right? Why are any given thoughts popping into my head at any given moment? Right? And why are any given emotions arising at any given moment? Right? And why are any particular reactions or reflexes or impulses within me, you know, happening at any given moment? So from a Buddhist perspective, we say, you know, well, that's past karma ripening. Those are the triggering of all of the subtle energetic impulses that constitute us, right? I know from a scientific perspective, you know, you can approach it from other angles and talk about it from other angles. So, you know, so when we talk about senses, perception, brain, mind, you know, reality, I mean, it's all of these things coming together, right? You know, why do I think the way I think? Why am I happy when I'm not happy? Why am I unhappy when I'm unhappy? You know, why do I, you know, get joy from this? Why is this totally, you know, lousy when this thing happens to me, right? Why does this person not care when that happens to them? And why do I care when the exact same thing happens to me, right? And, you know, and on and on and on and on, right? I mean, indefinitely, right? And so, I mean, this is what the Buddhist path is, right? This is what Buddhist training is. What Buddhist training is about is understanding where those things come from, why those things happen, right? Why does my mind function the way it does? Why do I react the way I do? How do I change my subtle impulses? How do I change the thoughts that pop into my head? Like, do you control your next thought? I mean, I think most of us think we control our next thought, right? It's like, I'm the master of the puppet, right? I mean, like, I'm in charge of the puppet. Like, I direct the mind, I direct the body, right? So I'm gonna control what the mind does, and I'm gonna control what the body does. I'm gonna, this is me. I'm in charge, right? Do you determine the next thought that's gonna come into your head? I mean, we pretty much think we do, right? that's generally our operating premise, right? It's like, I'm in charge here, right? I'm in charge of me, right? I mean, that is our fundamental operating premise, right? But we don't, in fact, at all control the next thought or any thought that's going to pop into our head ever, ever. There's like not one thought that you can make pop into your head, like consciously, intentionally, ever. It's kind of wild, right? So from a Buddhist perspective, that's, as karma ripens, it's driving all that. It's causing all that. It is the expression of all that, So every time I'm thinking a thought, that's the expression of karma ripening, and then, I mean, you'll get to it in next course, the movement of the mind and what follows is the definition of karma. The mind moves, the mind fluctuates, something happens after that, and everything that follows on from the fluctuation of the mind, is karma and the ripening of karma. So, like that. Digression. Sorry. I don't mind to digress if you don't mind. So,
how would you define fresh? Like
fresh?
Fresh state of mind, fresh, something that is just undiscovered with a surprise that you just haven't registered that data yet, or is it something more within the moment?
Yeah, I think it refers to in the moment, because you see, in this case, they're saying anything which is a memory is no longer fresh. Anything which is not in the moment is no longer fresh, and is no longer a pramana. Anything which is a memory, is no longer a pramana. Right?
Yeah. So it's not a sensorial thing.
No. Yeah. No. So I mean, it's because look, there are people who are blind. They have valid perceptions even though they can't see anything, right? So, yeah.
Or you, and then also like I'm looking at you and I'm having a conversation with you, and so that's fresh. And then the cupcake pops into my mind.
Yeah.
And now it's not a fresh perception of you because I'm thinking about the cupcake.
Well, even the thought you had a moment ago. I mean, if I'm looking at Jee and I say, she has her hand on her shoulder, that thought, as soon as it's done, is no longer fresh. It's an instant ago. It's a moment ago, right? So when you talk about a perception, the perception is that moment, right? That moment of perception, right? And and the mind streams from moment to moment, right? I mean, the mind is having a fresh perception every moment, right? And so all of the old moments are no longer fresh. Like as the mind streams from moment to moment, and it leaves behind all the perceptions which it's had instant to instant, right? So like that. Okay. So the next one, yichu, it means speculative. This is how most of us go through our lives. It's having an assumption. He's a jerk, right? Like, I know he's a jerk, right? Valid perception? No, it's an assumption, right? Like, Gee's like, no, it's definitely a valid perception. Like, yeah. So, I mean, do we know why a person did what they did? Not unless you can read their mind, right? And if you're an ordinary person, ordinary human beings don't read others' minds. And so, you don't know if, something happened to them when they were 14, that they're behaving that way, that's completely out of their control and they're justified, or, we don't know if, their partner just, found out they have a terminal illness, or, what. So we say, oh, they're a jerk, but, we don't know, And most of what we do in our lives is based on assumption and speculation, right? Most of our perceptions are based on assumption and speculation, right? So, and the point here is to become a good logician. to understand the nature of perception, the nature of a valid perception, so that we can be congruent, perhaps you could say, and be more aligned with the true nature of reality, rather than the unconscious, unexamined way that we normally live, right? There are just countless examples of this, right? Of making assumptions and thinking we know things when we really don't. I know what that person is like. I've got their story, right? We do it all day long in the subway. You see a person, you're like, they're that, right? You see the next person, oh, they're that. It's like all day long we have a narrative going in our mind where we're making assumptions, right? And we're speculating just based upon a few small little data points, a few bits of information, the way their hair looks, the way their clothes look, the way they're speaking, the way they're behaving, what they're doing, what they're not doing, right? So, it's pretty continuous, right? So, it's a particularly nasty one, really. So, I would say, this is particularly difficult in spiritual environments, because people say, like, I know and you don't, and people presume to know, or they say, like, there's one way and one way only, and if you're not doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. There's a lot of assumption and there's a lot of presumption in that, right? The Buddha taught 3 great turnings of the wheel, vast numbers of teachings, many of which said different things at different times, in apparent contradiction, because these 10,000 people needed to hear it that way, and those 3,000 people needed to hear it a different way, and those 5 people needed to hear the opposite thing, because it was helping them, because it was benefiting them, and it was moving them along their spiritual advancement, right? So we have to be really careful, right? So be careful of teachers saying things are this way only, right? When you teach people, everyone has a different level and a different need, and it's quite completely fine and completely normal to express impartial ideas, or incomplete ideas, or half an idea, or to tweak an idea slightly, because a person would absolutely reject an idea, and it's better that they get half the idea than no idea, right? So you got to be careful about that stuff. So, okay. So we live our lives as if our presumptions are true, right? We go through life thinking all of our assumptions and all of our presumptions are reality and are true and are accurate, right? Much better to go through life as if we really don't know what motivates other people, rather than coming to sort of presumptive judgments or presumptive conclusions about people. Much better to go through life thinking, I really don't know what motivates this person. They could be a great bodhisattva. They could be doing things to help every living being. I'm going to actually assume the best and not assume the worst. I'm going to withhold judgment, and certainly withhold any kind of negative projection or negative posturing, right? And try to train myself to not have perceptions which are unfounded, and which are presumptuous, and and worst of all, which are negative, right? And not constructive, right? So letting yourself think that a person is bad, or there's something wrong with them. I don't know about you. I can only speak for myself. So I'm where I'm coming from when I say this is, like, for me. Like, I grew up, like, constantly judging people. So from the time I was a kid, I was like, oh, they're dumb. Oh, they're ugly. Oh, they're this. Oh, they're that. Right? And it was completely baseless. Well, I'll say completely. I saw something, right? Their hair, their clothes, their behavior. There was a basis for me to assume that this perception of mine was accurate and valid, right? And so what the scripture is saying is, no, those are not accurate perceptions. Those are not valid perceptions. For you to take in a couple of data points about someone and then make an assumption that like you really know what's going on is absolutely not a valid perception, absolutely not a constructive way to live in the world, you know? So it's certainly not sema or pramana. It's certainly not going to help one's spiritual evolution, right? Or in one's spiritual path or practice, right? So much better to be in a state of mind where one says, I really don't know what's going on with anybody else, you know, and I don't want to make any assumptions about anybody else. And I want to think the best thoughts possible about everybody that I encounter and everybody that I meet. So I would rather train myself to reposition so that my default is to think something positive rather than something negative, right? So, you know, my job is to train myself to do a different kind of presumption and assumption, you know? And this ties in, you know, to one's vows and one's ethics and other things, and I don't want to digress too much, right? You know, but basic Buddhist path is, you know, ethics, concentration, wisdom, right? So being virtuous or being positive, right? Or having bodhisattva ideal or whatever you want to call that, you know, that is the basis of spiritual evolution and spiritual living in Buddhist practice, right? So if we're going to engage in Buddhist practice or spiritual practice, spiritual evolution, the core of that is ethics, which is virtue, which is being positive, right? Rather than negative. I mean, you can language it however you want, right? So if we understand that the nature of perception is subjective, and if we understand how we perceive and how the mind functions, which is, and it takes in some data points through the senses and scrambles them around, you know, and comes up with an idea and projects it, right? Then we want to take control of that process, right? I mean, we want to say fix that process. You know, we want to change the process from being a negative, destructive process to being a healthy, positive, virtuous process. So if I'm habituated, which, you know, I have been from the time I was a kid, you know, if I'm habituated to taking in a couple of data points and then doing negative ideation and negative projection, not a great way for me to live, and it's certainly not setting me up to have a happy life or to be spiritually evolved, right? So, you know, when we look at all this Buddhist stuff and we think about all this Buddhist stuff, we're like, okay, you know, I want to be virtuous, you know, I want to be ethical, I want to be a bodhisattva, I want to attain nirvana, enlightenment, etc. Right? Well, to do that, I have to stop engaging in negative thoughts and speech and deeds, right? And I have to engage in virtuous and positive thoughts and speech and deeds. And so I have to be training myself continuously, right, to do that. So every time I find myself taking in a few data points and you know, throwing it into a negative construct and projecting that as my reality, which is really there outside of me from its own side, there really is a jerk out there, you know, they really are a loser, they really are stupid, you know. You know, whenever I find myself doing that as an educated spiritual practitioner, I need to stop it and change it and do it differently and fix it, right? So when we're talking about these things, that's why we're talking about these things, right? I mean, you know, we talk about what's not valid perception, what's not fresh, unerring, unmistaken perception, what's not sema, what's not pramana. The point is to know that these are the perceptions we don't want to have. You know, we want to have pramana, we want to have sema, we want to have valid perceptions, right? Well, you want to have fresh, unerring, unmistaken perceptions. You know, and when you wrap that into the whole Buddhist path, that involves being virtuous, right? Being a bodhisattva and making efforts to change ourselves, to evolve ourselves so that we, you know, can attain nirvana and enlightenment, right? I should ask, do you guys have a quickie break? I think we have, I don't know what time it is. Should have a quickie break. So I think we have to plug, everyone should buy a latte or something to like pay the 3 joules rent, right? Buy a cookie, whatever it is you do, right? Let's take a break and support the 3 joules through your consumption. And see you in a few minutes. Yeah. Ready? Okay. Shall we, you had a question. You changed your mind? What?
I got insecure about my question.
You what? You got what?
I got insecure about my question.
Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. Don't be of two minds. Come on.
But that's doubt, so it's not valid, right? I was gonna ask about that whole like, okay, so the karma and it is something that I planted in the past. But I have, like, my question is, it's really like the free will control thing of like, do I have control over my mind or do I not? Because in the moment, it would seem that I don't, except that I have a perception that I do. So then that's valid.
It's very confusing.
Yeah, but then, and then the whole Buddhist path is on the premise that we do have, that we could eventually have control over that. But when you like analyze, then the thing that pops up, I am a slave to whatever pops up based on what I did in the past. But then in that moment, I'm just like, which one is it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So is the question, which one is it?
Yeah, do I have the control or do I not? Well, I only have the control in the past, but that means that I have the control then, so I have it now.
So how do things exist? Like, you know, the whole free will, do I have control thing? Like, how do you exist, right? Like there's stuff there, right? You're there. Obviously you're there. We're speaking, right? So you have a body and you have a mind, right? You are, your identity is a construct placed, you know, upon the body and the mind. You know, there's a basis there, and you overlay or think or conceive that, you know, I'm a woman, I'm me, right? You know, I'm Sarah, right? So, you know, Sarah can't be hurt because Sarah doesn't exist except as a concept, right? And the body can be hurt, you know, a mind can be upset, but there's not a Sarah, you know, that's going to like get damaged and be like a damaged thing, because it's just an idea, right? And the same is true of the wall and the floor and everything else. This is, you know, there's something solid here, it's flat and it's smooth, and then the idea of the wall is there, right? Same is true of everything. That's how everything exists, right? Everything exists based upon being conceptualized and labeled and named, right? And thought of that way, right? Same is true of free will. Same is true of what you're asking about. Does free will exist really? No, nothing exists really. Of course not. How could it? I mean, there is no such thing as a self-existent object. There's no I mean, sorry if we didn't do this yet, but there's no self-existent Sarah, right? There's no self-existent wall. There's no self-existent free will. None of it exists from its own side. It's kind of a little perplexing to me, you know, that it's like the big unanswered paradigm in Buddhism, is there free will? Of course not. Nothing exists from its own side. I mean, you don't exist from your own side. Why would free will exist from its own side? You know what I mean? Is there a concept of free will? Yeah. Is there a concept of Sarah? Yeah. Is there a concept of wall? Yeah. Are they valid? Yeah. Do they function? Yeah. No problem. See what I mean?
A little, maybe what you were saying earlier about retraining your mind. So instead of thinking about it as the free will, it's I'm retraining my mind to act differently, not so that I have control, but so that I'm creating a better future. I'm going to look at people with a much more open mind, a less judgmental mind. Free will. So I'm freely choosing to do this to better my future, because I can't change what happened right now. I can't change the interaction I'm having right now. That seed started a long time ago.
Right, it's kind of like a rabbit hole, right? So you're saying if you go down the rabbit hole, if you go down the Alice in Wonder rabbit hole, right? Like how far down the rabbit hole do you go, and what do you get to, and what's the ultimate answer, right?
The ultimate answer is that there is a different level of reality, ultimate reality, right? Which is a non-conceptual level of reality, right? And so as we try to say, Because from a Buddhist perspective, what we're talking about is deceptive reality and ultimate reality when we're talking about these things, right? We're saying, look, we live our lives of conventional reality, thinking unexamined thoughts, not thinking about all of the chemicals sloshing around and, electrons bouncing around and photons and, subatomic particles and everything else, right? And whatever's below that, on and on and on, right? So, because if we walked around trying to get to like the underlying basis, we're not very functional. I mean, you're not going to walk down the street very well if you're like totally absorbed in like what my subatomic particles are doing to move my finger, or something like that. I don't know, right? So, we live and we function at a conventional level, and it's what our lives are, and it's what our world is. And Buddhism says, okay, that's deceptive reality. That's fine. It functions. It's who we are. We are human beings because we are functioning that way. That's what makes us human beings, the fact that we function this way. However, there are other ways of being and other levels of reality which, aren't this conventional reality, and where the mind doesn't function this way, right? And the senses don't function this way, and perception doesn't function this way. And if you're going to sort of understand that and experience it directly and perceive it directly, then it requires training and discipline and effort, and just like anything else in life, right? And so, if one is saying, well, all right, well, I'm going to, engage in some study and training and effort and discipline to, experience a different kind of life and a different kind of existence and a different kind of perception and reality, then one is going beyond the conceptual dualistic construct of, outer, inner, me, you, up, down, boy, girl, because, those constructs, all the conceptual elaborations and constructs have implicit limitations in what they can perceive and how they can function. So when we start to kind of take that journey, if you will, from conventional reality to say, all right, I'm understanding a little more deeply and more deeply and more deeply, and I get that there are these subtle impulses that arise, and things are coming from past residual impulses and karmic seeds and the rest, right? But like, what's my insertion point where I can do something, right? Like, where do I insert myself along that chain that I can actually say, ooh, I decided to do this and it made a difference, right? So, that's where it becomes very difficult because it's quite subtle, right? And we have different levels of coarse and subtle mind, right? So, I mean, we don't normally experience it. We don't normally think of ourselves this way, or even perceive ourselves or experience ourselves this way. But even as a meditator, even as a consistent meditator, one can see that when one is meditating nicely, the dualistic constructs of the mind stop functioning or stop being active. And you can say, oh, that coarse level of my mind, which I use in everyday outer life, isn't engaged now because I'm in a subtle meditative state, right? So I'm using a more subtle aspect of my mind and a more subtle level of my mind, right? And then, onward and onward and downward to more and more subtle states. So it's tricky because we say, well, I'm using my constructs right now, and I'm using this coarse mind right now, and I want to understand it, and I want to know how to think about it, and I want to know exactly how it functions, and I want to know exactly at what point, like, ABC happens and what the formula is, right? However, that construct-based mind is almost by definition very limited, and it's operating here when the more subtle stuff is happening here. So you're trying to use this to understand and get to this, and they're different things, So it's unfortunately not possible for me to address the answer in a specific, formulaic way. Yes.
Where it comes from, I don't know. That's the mystery of present karma. There's make a choice. Do I continue the past karma or seek a new karma? realm of powers and things like that, like you could see, somehow that's in the present moment when you choose it. And as it grows, you gain more awareness and more choice. But that takes awareness somehow. You wake up, whatever reason, it gives us, oh, I don't want this anymore, that's the present moment. And we cultivate it. And as it's cultivated, it gets stronger and more. And Nirvana, from my viewpoint, is 100% present moment. Or it transcends karma ultimately.
So, from a ultimate,
One says if one has a direct perception of emptiness or ultimate reality, one then directly experiences that the conceptual mind and conventional reality is completely, ass backwards, lokshe, right? It's just completely wrong and completely off, right? However, as a human being who might be having a deep meditative experience of ultimate reality, when you're not in the deep meditative experience and you're just walking around saying, watch out for the puddle, right? I mean, you're still having ordinary perceptions, right? Conventional reality perceptions. So, if we talk about what's an accurate perception, well, the direct experience of ultimate reality or emptiness isn't ultimately an accurate perception, right? Is ultimate valid perception. As an ordinary human being, saying that's Sarah and she's a lady is a fine, conventional, human, valid perception. So it's like that. So the fifth one, just to cover the material, the fifth one is Nanglama Nyepa. And this happens with my kids all the time. It appears to you, but you don't ascertain it. This is a perception where you don't really get, it's like you call your kids and you're like, come to dinner, nothing. Come to dinner, nothing. Come to dinner. It's like, were you talking to me? I didn't hear you, So, you're absorbed in a movie or in a TV show, or, you're reading a book, or you're, intently focused on something, and somebody talks to you or somebody tries to get your attention and it doesn't even register, right? You don't even hear them or whatever it might be. So that's when something is actually appearing to you in a normal way, but it's just mind is just not even registering it. It's not even clicking in. It's not getting it, right? Just it doesn't register. It appears, but you don't ascertain it. You might have some hear some vague background noise somewhere that you think is irrelevant to you when somebody's calling you, because you don't want to hear, you're busy or whatever the case might be, right? Something like that. So what that would be like, never happened to you. Yeah. Perfect. Should we ask Armando? Should we? I don't know. Should we?
Why are you honking at me?
Yeah. So those are all perceptions which are not accurate or valid. Those 5 different types of perceptions are not accurate or valid, and those is kind of our normal life, right? It's kind of how we go through normal life. So, and we're constantly doing judgment and negative engagement based upon having those not valid perceptions. So. So a Buddha is called a person of pramana, being a pramana. A Buddha only speaks what they know to be a direct and valid perception. So it's one of the qualities of a Buddha is they are called a sema, being a valid perception. So the second chapter of the book that we're studying is about nirvana, omniscience, and enlightenment. The paths to reach them, right? The paths to reach nirvana and enlightenment. So the reason that this book was actually written was to talk about the path to nirvana and omniscience and enlightenment, right? So when they wrote the book, they basically said, look, there's this thing called nirvana, there's this thing called omniscience, there's this thing called enlightenment. And then they had to go about proving it, right? So this book was written because they actually needed to prove that there was such a thing as nirvana and enlightenment. And so when they talk about past and future lives, it's actually just kind of an aside. It's kind of just a small part of the picture that they're addressing here, because they have to prove that there's such a thing as a past and future life to prove that there's something called nirvana and enlightenment, which can be attained and which can be achieved, right? So Um, so that's the subject of the second chapter of the book. Mm, and they want to establish, I think last week you talked about hidden, the 3 levels of reality, right? Which are hidden. Those are very technical terms. Slightly obscure.
And the other Shintuka.
Shintuka. Right. So what is the English for culture?
Not.
Subtle workings of karma.
The disadvantage of a small phone, right? You can't get the whole thing. So there's, so if you talk about levels of reality, there's what we see, right? There's obvious reality. You look around, you see stuff, right? There's obvious level of reality, right? So, and then what's the next level that's not as easy to perceive? Hidden reality. There's a hidden level of reality, which is difficult to perceive, but
using logic and deduction and reasoning, right? And then there's Shintukokir, which is very hidden, deeply hidden level of reality, right? So, let me think. I mean, no. I was gonna just like here. I don't want a pen. What did you say? I was trying to like if so if you hear that, right? You didn't see it. You couldn't observe it, except over there maybe, right? But you guys couldn't see it, right? But something happened, right? Now, can you deduce or use logic to understand what happened? So what happened? So that's a deduction, but you couldn't see it, right? So there's a whole class and category of stuff that exists which you can't perceive directly, but which you can fairly readily use logic to understand or to deduce or to comprehend, right? So that's the purpose of logic. The purpose of logic is to train the mind to be able to penetrate into into hidden phenomena, into a hidden level of reality which you can't directly perceive. Yeah.
Is there a fine line between that and the level of speculation?
Yeah. Sure. You may get it wrong, right?
You can think of things that seem logical to you as
That's right.
points that you could kind of see, or what we heard barely was part of our sensory data.
Mm-hmm.
We can put those together logically.
That's right.
But that can.
But would it be a valid perception? Would it be a sema?
Well, more technically, say his behavior is a jerk. He himself isn't. And that's to a subtle point. Let's do being a jerk right now versus he isn't.
yeah. So right now I'm simply talking about logic and deduction, right? Which is not a sema, because it's not a fresh, unerring perception, right? Okay? It's not fresh. It's a deduction. Right? It could fall into one of those categories. It could be an assumption or a presumption based on inadequate information, right? And so that's the purpose of logic. That's the purpose of training to be a logician, is because as one trains the mind to be logical, and one is able to accurately analyze.
One can get to a point where they have a deep insight and a deep understanding, which is not a direct perception. It's not a direct experience. So, there are things which are deeply hidden phenomena which we can't perceive if we're not enlightened. Like, the laws of karma fall in that category. Like, why does this leaf turn this way and have this shading around the edge? Well, because 3 million years ago, I did whatever thing. No idea. There's no way I can even begin to deduce it. That I have this leaf in my life that has this shape and color and positioning. No idea. Right? And everything else is like that. So it's deeply hidden. Even logic, I can't get to it even through logic, right? But there's a whole class of stuff I can use logic on, like when we talk about emptiness or ultimate reality. Like the first time somebody said to you, this conventional reality is actually wrong, it's inconsistent with higher reality, there's actually a broken realm of defective perceptions based upon a mind that doesn't function very well, right? Like the first time somebody said that to you, you probably were like, what are you talking about, man? You know, what are you going on about, right? So, you know, and someone explains it more and you hear about it more, and, you know, you have all these logical arguments and statements presented, and, you know, one thing follows another, and you kind of come to go, oh, okay, I understand there could be other levels of reality. Oh, I understand that the way I perceive is my ordinary thought process is not really reflective of what's going on underneath, you know, or behind the curtain, if you will, right? So, you know, this whole process of using logic to penetrate into and understand hidden phenomena is very powerful and very profound. There's a whole, you know, very important class of stuff that we can use logic to you know, to comprehend and to deduce, right? The ultimate goal being to have a valid perception of ultimate reality, right? And that's, you know, that's why we do all this, because we want to get to a point where we can know for certain what a pure world is, or what pure existence is, or what, you know, the basis of a spiritual life, or a you know, an unafflicted life is. Like, what does an unafflicted mind look like? What does an unafflicted life look like? What does a pure mind and a pure life look like? What does a pure existence look like, right? You know, is it possible, right? And that's why this chapter was written. This chapter was written because they're like, yeah, there's nirvana, yeah, there's omniscience, you know, but you have to understand how it works, and you have to understand what it is and how you get to it, and you have to understand the path. And so, you know, that's why this book was written, and that's why we're talking about these things, right? Because we want to get to the point where we can experience those things ourselves. We want to be able to experience omniscience, enlightenment, nirvana, ultimate reality, right? If we had an experience of any of those things, we would be very different beings. We would have very different lives, you know? I mean, even on a simple level, I mean, it's a very inadequate example, but like even on a simple level, when one, you know, when one loves for the first time, you know, it's like, oh, there's this wonderful thing that I've never done before. And it's this incredible state. And it's like, oh my God, it's so amazing. It's like my first like true love, and, you know, yada, 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 right? You know, and it's this like experience that changes you, and you're like, oh, now I just want to be in that state, and I want to be there, and I want to feel that, and I want to experience that, and I want to live like that, and, you know, that's better than what the alternative was, right? So, I mean, it's a very kind of small example, but it's the same idea, right? It's like when you experience another level of reality, or another, you know, higher state, if you will. It's just like, oh, now I know what it's like, and I really want that, and that's where I want to be, and that's how I want to be, and, you know, and that's what I'm devoting my life to, and that's what I'm committing my life to, and, you know, I don't need to be a jerk to everyone anymore, you know, or whatever, you know. So like that, right? So there are three things we want to try to establish, right? And we can't even be sure they exist. And they say that in the text. They say, look, you don't know nirvana exists. You don't know there's such a thing as omniscience. You don't know that there's such a thing as enlightenment. So we have to prove it. You know, you don't know that you're not done when when this body falls over. So, you know, we have to prove it. You know, if you don't believe that there's something after this body falls over and stops working, then, you know, there's no basis for all the rest. So that's really the point, right? And they say, look, we're going to talk to you about all these. We're going to talk about, you got to be moral, you know, the importance of ethics, the importance of virtue, the importance of training the mind, the importance of all these things, right? It's all irrelevant if, you know, if there's no such thing as nirvana or enlightenment or omniscience. I mean, if virtue doesn't matter, if we can't prove to you that virtue matters, why bother, right? Why are you doing this? I mean, it's just somebody's blah, blah, right? So that's really the point of the book. The point of the book is to say, you have to understand logic, you have to understand the nature of perception, you have to understand valid perception, so that you can examine these things. So you can say, okay, when you tell me about the importance of ethics, you know, I believe it because, you know, you tell me there's nirvana, omniscience, enlightenment, I believe it because, you know, not just because, you know, you got to beautiful shade of burgundy and saffron that you wear, right? So, in that third category of things, the things which are deeply hidden, those are things which, it's not possible to investigate even with logic. So we have to take them on faith. And what is faith? Faith is understanding that there are beings that only speak tsema, pramana, valid perceptions. That the Buddha, there's a being, or there are beings that only speak ultimate truth. And so if they say, well, you can't see this and you never will, and this is the way it is, then you evaluate that and say, all right, good enough for me or not good enough for me, right? I'll stick with the first two levels of observable phenomena and hidden phenomena that I can use logic on, and I'll just set aside all the deeply hidden phenomena, right? And I'm not going to do the take it on faith thing, right? So I mean, we don't really know until we experience higher reality. We don't really know what a tsema is, right? We can speak about what's a valid perception for a human being, right? So, so there are two kinds of tsemas. So there's one which we have through direct perception, right? You use our senses and we have a direct perception of it. And, it doesn't depend on reasoning. It's just you use your senses, you use your mind. It's fresh and unmistaken, right? Straightforward, straight up, right? No problem there. And then the second is a deductive reasoning. It's through logic, right? So we need to have good reasons which will lead us to actually understand or see or experience something. When one becomes a good logician, one can actually get to the point where you really get it. I don't know if you had the experience, you probably have, where someone explains something to you and you go like, oh, I got it. It's like you don't understand, and finally you get some really good explanation, some really good logic, and you're like, oh, now I get it, right? Then you understand. It hopefully happens in school all the time, right? When one went to school, right? So this is the idea of logic and reasoning, right? So you can use logic and reasoning to really get it, right? Even though you're not directly perceiving it. I mean, math is like that. I never did get math, but it's like all these concepts, you get some of them, I don't get some of them, but they're mystical and profound and they do stuff, right? I don't know. Anyway. Okay. So, when we talk about deductive reasoning, there are three kinds of deductive reasoning. And the first is logical. Logical reasoning is used to perceive hidden things, right? And then there's belief in authority, which is used to perceive deeply hidden things, right? So, obvious things, no problem. We observe them with our senses, right? Hidden phenomena, we use logic to perceive. And then deeply hidden phenomena, we have to have belief in authority to have deductive reasoning. Now you could say, I don't know, how's that deductive reasoning? If I met the Buddha and the Buddha said to me, your karma is this, that, and the other tomorrow. And you're just like, okay, I believe you. How is that deductive reasoning? Well, you'd have to really use logic to understand that the Buddha can only speak the truth. Otherwise, it's not, right? It's just you listen to somebody who's telling you something. So anyway, the third type of deductive reasoning is just based on convention. We all agree to call that a projector, so we call it a projector, and it's not very important. And it's kind of how most things are in the world. We agree to call that a blanket. We agree to call it a fan, and it functions. And it's the logic everybody uses. No big deal. So it's not. It's convention, right? People agree upon something. It's generally accepted, and so it's true. So I mean, it's logic from the sense that does everyone in the room agree that this is a floor? Everyone says yes, I agree. This is the floor. So therefore, it's logical to call it a floor. That's all. It's not a big deal. It's not really important. Okay. Just want to make sure I cover everything. Yeah, I think that covers the nut of it. The purpose of the class is to have a valid perception about nirvana and Buddhahood, right? So we talked about karmic seeds, right? So we're here in this class because we have certain bakshakas, we have certain karmic seeds to think a certain way and to be attracted to certain things. So we all have some kind of past seeds or impulses to be attracted to Buddhism, right? And so we're in this class and we're listening to these things and we're talking about these things, right? So to your question, how do we take those seeds which have ripened and which have brought us here and move forward with that? How do we capitalize upon that? How do we make the most of it? And how do we say, okay, I've got all these seeds ripening that have put me here to hear about this stuff, to learn this stuff, to understand this stuff, now what, right? Well, now, we use logic to say, to the bottom of, is there such a thing as a future life and a past life? Because if I really get to the bottom of whether there's a future and a past life, and I really logically deduce or conclude that there really is a past and future life, maybe I should care about it. Maybe I should do something a little different. Maybe I shouldn't just live for today. In the scheme of things, if we live for 80 years out of a trillion or whatever it is, an infinite number of years, maybe 80 years and an infinite number of years is pretty small potatoes, and I should try to invest well to have a good trillion years, and even if it means a couple of decades of hard work, or something like that, right? So that's why we do this. That's why the book was written. That's why we're talking about past and future lives, is to be able to say, okay, there's a future life. How am I going to reposition here, given that new understanding or that new conclusion? Yeah.
Listening to a podcast today, and they're talking about how there's a study done with certain patients where they were blind their whole lives. And the study was to prove that we can't really see anything without past experiences because our mind is computing everything, and that's how we see the world.
Yeah.
So when they did like a cornea transplant, there was a lot of patients who, after they received the transplant, got to realize that logically they could perceive things, they couldn't. And so it's like they couldn't see anything, so it would just be like blobs everywhere. So it just reminded me of this whole talk, whose emptiness, like can't, like nothing is real, because it's like if they have eyesight, they're just not seeing things. Like how can we think
Like where does the sight come from? Right?
Yeah.
If you just get the organ, you get your sight.
Yeah.
If you just connect the right nerves, you get your sight.
Yeah.
A similar thing, they've done experiments where they put baby cats in a room with stripes or zigzag or something, and then it totally messes up their perception for the rest of their life, and they can't see certain things and they want to see other things.
But they say it's because only certain brain cells are developed, and once they develop, they can't develop anymore, and so that's all they can see because it's the only brain cells there.
Yeah.
And so that's what they call the imprinting stage, where you can imprint anything, but once that stage is gone, only what's been imprinted will continue for the rest of your life. Humans have the ability to be malleable, that we can change that. But I say only if you're a successful meditator. If you're not a successful meditator, you're frozen just like any other path.
Well, it's interesting because science is malleable too, right? It wasn't that long ago where science said that the brain is, it matures and then it's done, and it doesn't, if you damage it, it doesn't too bad. Now science says the brain is plastic, and it's constantly trimming and growing, and you can, brain can repair and regenerate and do all sorts of things that 10 years ago or whatever it was, they said it couldn't do.
Buddhist perspective, all of these things are reflective of the fact that there's not a concrete reality, right? There's not a self-existent paradigm. There's not a self-existent world which exists in a certain way from its own side. From a Buddhist perspective, we say, look, there's stuff. There's a basis of experience. There's a basis of perception. There's a basis of sensory input, right? Now, what we take in and what we construct and what we project and experience as our reality is completely unique to us. Not just at the level of, I like this and I don't like this, or I can see and I can't see, but also at the level of, could I take in sensory information and project, a different realm? Yeah. I mean, from a Buddhist perspective, absolutely. The fact that we have these sense organs and the fact that we have a mind that takes in the data and constructs it to perceive this stuff is what makes us human. If we had a mind and senses to take in the data, which constructed it differently and projected it differently as a different realm, then we would be a being of a different realm, right? So, the fundamental premise is simply, there's a being with a mind and a body. Some beings don't have bodies, they're mind only, formless, in Buddhist cosmology. So the fundamental premise is simply, beings have a body and a mind, different levels of evolution, right? And they take in the information through their senses, whatever senses they may or may not have. Beings of different realms have different sensory capacities. Beings of some realms have certain senses and don't have other senses in Buddhist cosmology. And so you take in the information through your senses, and the mind constructs it and projects it as your world and your experience and your body and your reality, right? And that could be angelic or hell realm or human or dog or, or any number of things, right? And it's simply a function of how is the mind functioning? What impulses are arising, and how is the mind functioning to construct those impulses into experience and reality, right? So, if there's anger and aggression, we'd say, oh, well, that's a really hostile, violent person as a human being. Well, there are beings that have, those kinds of impulses, which might have a mind that creates a much more destructive, suffering world, hell realm or whatever it might be, So that's, from a Buddhist perspective, just how it works. We'd say, you could be a human being and you could be having an amazing life with no money. You could be a human being, you could be having a lousy life with no money. You could be a human being having a lousy life with a lot of money. You could be a human being have a lousy life with, a great life with a lot of money. So there's so many possible permutations, and it's all about our inner landscape and what impulses are arising, how our mind is, conceiving and constructing and projecting based upon the impulses that are arising, right? Does that make sense? Right.
Concept of the past and future life incarnations and how that could be deducted somehow. So, on the other hand, modern science that prides itself on using the dark process logic, they have not come to the same conclusion. So, from the Buddhist standpoint, just in a nutshell, what exactly the line of deduction that allows one to arrive at that conclusion?
That's class 5. She's going to do that. But just I don't want to jump ahead.
No, please. Just very nutshell.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. Science has a certain capacity. The instrumentation is a certain level of capacity and refinement, right?
We saw in the last couple of weeks or the last month or two, now the articles are appearing in the press that say, oh, science has discovered that when the heart is stopped and when the brain is stopped, people aren't actually dead. And they would sort of went back to, I don't remember how long ago it was, a couple of decades ago, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years, whatever. And the scientific thinking was when the heart stops, the person is dead. It doesn't matter, nothing else matters, right? And then they came out later and they say, well, there's actually still brain activity, consciousness, awareness, even after the heart stops. So they're not really dead when the heart stops. They're dead when the brain stops. And so now, last month, they're like, well, they're not really dead when the brain stops. So there is a limitation to scientific instrumentation, which changes over time, right? So that's the first thing I would say. And as you get into logic and the study of logic, what you'll find is that the fact that something has not been proven is not the same as the fact that it doesn't exist, right? So for science to say, well, we haven't proven that there's a future life, doesn't mean that there's no future life. It simply means they haven't proven it. Anyway, there's a whole line of reasoning which is logical. And so the basic approach and the basic premise is that there's a whole series of possible explanations as to how things exist and how they don't exist. And by using logic, you can eliminate all possible options except for one. So if you're being logical and you say, well, everything has a cause, everything must be caused, right? So as a Buddhist, we believe that. And you say, here's a list of all the possible causes for that outcome, right? And I've eliminated all possible causes except one. Therefore, logically, that must be the cause. It's the only remaining cause which hasn't been disproven. So there's a whole logical approach and logical. That's where logic comes in. Because you have, if you believe in logic, right, and if you're logical and you say everything is caused, let's do a thorough examination, a thorough evaluation. Well, that's very possible. I mean, probably lots of causes we haven't thought of. You can, but then you have to say, well, what is the basis upon which one wants to live one's life? One could say, well, there's lots of things I can't think of, so I'm not going to think of anything. I mean, I think, as a thoughtful person, one makes a choice of, I'll use the faculties I have, and work within that paradigm, or I'll just throw it all out the window and say nothing matters because I can't figure it all out and I can't see everything and I can't know everything. So that goes back to class. I don't remember what class it was. I think is it in this class? Maybe it's in this class. Anyway, what are the possible causes of existence? What are the possible causes of me? If I want to talk about a paradigm for existence and living, right? There's a creator God, there's randomness, there's causation, and then look at the logical proof for each one, right? And you go through logical arguments for and against each one, right? And so you say, all right, in the end, you're left with saying, I can accept that there's massive complexity, which is unfathomable and incomprehensible, and we are the result of massive complexity that can never be understood, right? And that's how I'm going to live my life. That's a personal choice, though, you see. And some people choose that. Some people just choose to say, look, too complicated. You never figure it out, and therefore, I don't care, or I'm not going to bother, or I'm not going to worry about it. You see what I mean? So my sister-in-law was actually in the Army Reserves, and she got deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, and she had studied a lot of religions, different religions, and after she got shot, blown up, ambushed, etc., she put a lot of thought and time into why am I here and what religion is really true, and it's very insightful. She just one day we were talking, and she said, with all religions, you reach a point where you can't prove it. You can't directly experience it, right? And then you have to decide which one is a useful basis for you to live your life, right? So I think that's very insightful. For me personally, the distinction with Buddhism, and I grew up Catholic, so for me it was like, believe it all and it'll be fine. As long as you do what we tell you to do. Or else, right? But for me, from a Buddhist perspective, the appeal of the Buddhist approach is that there's a whole logical process, and that there is a very diligent and exhaustive and thorough approach to be intellectual and logical in evaluating and considering the stuff, right? To say, yeah, maybe it's true or maybe it's not, maybe it works or maybe it doesn't, right? But at least there is a framework which is laid out where one can say, okay, I can do diligent research here, I can do diligent study here, I can dig in here and get to a point where I feel like it's logical and makes sense, or it's not logical and it doesn't make sense and it doesn't work for me, So for me, it has that going for me, and I find that very helpful and very useful, It makes sense. So, and that's why these materials that Holy Geshe Michael presented are so wonderful, because it's very rare in our culture, in our society, to have a sort of an ancient system laid out top to bottom in a comprehensive and progressive fashion to say, here's a roadmap, follow the roadmap, you get to the destination. Sadly, most of the time we don't follow the roadmap, but we still want to get to the destination. It's like, can I just not drive that stretch of the road, and will I still end up in Iowa? You know, it's like not usually. You know, it's like so. We each do our own exploration. We each do our own journey. You know, and we each decide how much effort we want to make, and how much time and energy we want to put into it, and what works for us and what doesn't. And I'm very grateful, and I'm very fortunate to have had these materials sort of brought from the Tibetan monastic world into our culture and our society, so that and to be presented in a way where we can have it just laid out in front of us very clearly to read and study and understand and say yeah or no or whatever it's going to be. So all right, I'll stop rambling. I don't know what time it is, but I think it's probably time to stop. So thank you, Jee, for inviting me. It's nice to be able to teach the new 3 jewels. Yay. I got my third 3 jewels under my belt now. So again, bring your awareness to the holy being above your crown and feel their presence with you, and be aware of their mind and its peace and joy and love, and try to see it and feel it very clearly. Again, visualize them as a glowing being of light above your crown, very small. And see them become smaller and smaller, and then merge into your heart and bless you, and feel all of the feelings of their heart and mind. And by the power of the goodness we have engaged in this evening, may we quickly come to experience ultimate reality, and may we quickly attain nirvana and enlightenment. Thank you. Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Then Jee wouldn't teach. Jee has to teach. I mean, I taught her all this stuff so that she could teach. But thank you for the invitation. It's a very nice treat to come and